Welcome to Night Crime Stories. Tonight, we examine the case of H. Holmes, America's first serial killer who built a hotel of horrors in 1890 Chicago. His so-called murder castle concealed deadly secrets behind every door. Settle in, turn off the lights, and let the case unfold. Maintain a slow, deliberate pace throughout. This case involves human trafficking and exploitation of vulnerable populations. Approach with dignity and respect for victims while maintaining investigative rigor. Emphasize the systematic nature of the abuse and the failures of oversight systems. Use pauses effectively to let the gravity of the situation settle with listeners. In the quiet hours of night, when most of us rest safely in our homes, there exists a darker reality that thrives in the shadows of our agricultural system. Tonight, we examine a case that pulls back the curtain on a modern form of slavery that operated for years in plain sight, protected by isolation and the vulnerability of its victims. The story we're about to explore takes us into the heart of America's farmlands, where the promise of honest work became a trap of perpetual debt and chemical dependency. It's a case that reveals how easily human dignity can be stripped away when systems designed to protect the vulnerable fail at their most basic level. This is the story of Ronald Robert Evans Sr. and his labor camps in Florida and North Carolina. It's a story about homeless individuals seeking nothing more than a chance to earn an honest living, only to find themselves ensnared in a web of exploitation that would take years to unravel. As we journey through this investigation tonight, we'll witness how predators can operate within legitimate industries, how bureaucratic failures can enable ongoing abuse, and how the most vulnerable members of our society can disappear into systems that view them as nothing more than disposable labor. The recruitment always began with hope. In the soup kitchens of Atlanta, the homeless shelters of Jacksonville, and the street corners of cities across the Southeast, Ronald Evans and his associates would appear with promises that seemed almost too good to be true. Clean housing. Steady work. 3 meals a day. Transportation provided. For men and women who had been living rough, sleeping in doorways and scraping together enough change for their next meal, these offers represented salvation. Evans presented himself as a legitimate farm labor contractor, someone who connected willing workers with agricultural opportunities. His pitch was practiced and persuasive. He understood exactly what his target audience wanted to hear. He spoke of dignity through work, of the satisfaction that comes from honest labor under the open sky. He painted pictures of workers who had pulled themselves up from nothing, who had found purpose and stability through his program. The men and women who accepted these offers came from all walks of life. Some were military veterans who had struggled to readjust to civilian life. Others were individuals who had lost jobs during economic downturns and found themselves unable to break free from the cycle of homelessness. Many battled addiction, seeking a fresh start away from the temptations and triggers of urban environments. What they all shared was desperation and a willingness to believe that someone cared enough to offer them a real opportunity. Evans would arrive in cities with passenger vans, ready to transport groups of workers to his operations. The camps he described sounded modest but adequate. Basic dormitory-style housing, communal kitchens, and nearby fields where they would harvest crops alongside other seasonal workers. He explained that workers would be charged $50 per week for housing and meals, deducted directly from their paychecks. This seemed reasonable, even generous, to people who had been paying much more for far less in urban environments. The transportation itself was the first sign that something wasn't quite right, though few of the recruits recognized it at the time. The vans were often overcrowded, with workers packed together for journeys that could last many hours. Evans's associates who drove these vehicles were not particularly friendly or communicative. They seemed more like guards than helpful staff members. Windows were often tinted heavily, making it difficult for passengers to see where they were going or to remember the route they had traveled. During these long rides, Evans would sometimes elaborate on the rules and expectations of his operations. Workers were expected to be ready for work each morning at dawn. They would be transported to various agricultural sites throughout the region, depending on seasonal demands. Payday came once a week, every Friday afternoon. He emphasized that this was a serious business operation, not a charity. Those who worked hard and followed the rules would be well treated. Those who caused problems would be sent back to wherever they came from. What Evans didn't explain during these recruitment sessions was the true nature of the debt system he had created. He didn't mention that the $50 weekly housing charge was just the beginning of a complex web of fees and expenses that would quickly consume any wages his workers might earn. He certainly didn't discuss the company store that operated on his properties, or the inflated prices charged for basic necessities. And he never revealed that his operation included the systematic distribution of illegal drugs as a method of both payment and control. The reality that awaited workers at Evans's labor camps bore little resemblance to the opportunities they had been promised. The Palatka, Florida facility and the Newton Grove, North Carolina operation were isolated compounds surrounded by agricultural land, far from public transportation, law enforcement oversight, or any means of escape for workers who might have second thoughts about their situation. The housing conditions were immediately shocking to new arrivals. Rather than the clean, basic accommodations they had been led to expect, workers found themselves assigned to overcrowded dormitories with minimal furnishing and poor ventilation. Mattresses were often stained and worn, lacking proper bedding. Bathroom facilities were inadequate for the number of residents, creating unsanitary conditions that would persist throughout the operations. The isolation of these camps was not accidental. Evans had deliberately chosen locations that were miles from the nearest towns, accessible only by roads that he and his associates controlled. Workers who arrived at these facilities quickly discovered that they had no practical means of leaving. They had been transported there in Evans's vehicles, they had no money for alternative transportation, and they often didn't even know exactly where they were located geographically. Within the first few days of arrival, new workers would be introduced to the company store that operated on each property. This was presented as a convenience, a way for workers to purchase necessities without having to travel to distant towns. What quickly became apparent, however, was that the store served a much more sinister purpose. Prices for basic items like soap, toothpaste, and clothing were inflated far beyond reasonable retail levels. A can of soda that might cost 75 cents in a regular store would be priced at $3 in Evans's company stores. More disturbing still was the range of illegal and controlled substances available through these stores. Workers could purchase untaxed generic beer, contraband cigarettes, and most shocking of all, crack cocaine. The availability of these substances was not hidden or treated as unusual. Instead, Evans and his associates presented drug sales as a normal part of their business operation, just another service provided for the convenience of their workers. The work itself was grueling and dangerous. Workers were transported each morning to various agricultural sites throughout the regions, where they would spend long hours in fields under harsh conditions. The physical demands were extreme, particularly for individuals who might already be dealing with health issues related to homelessness, addiction, or advanced age. Safety equipment was minimal or non-existent. Workers were expected to maintain productivity levels that were difficult for even healthy, experienced agricultural workers to achieve. Evans's payment system was designed to ensure that workers never accumulated enough money to leave his operations. While he claimed to pay minimum wage, the reality was far different. After deductions for housing, meals, company store purchases, and various fees and penalties, workers often found themselves owing money to Evans rather than being owed wages. The $50 weekly housing charge, which had seemed reasonable during recruitment, was just the beginning of a complex series of expenses that would quickly consume any earnings. Perhaps most insidiously, Evans instituted a system of pay advances that trapped workers in cycles of debt that became impossible to escape. Workers could request advances on their upcoming wages, ostensibly to purchase necessities or handle emergencies. These advances, however, came with 100% interest rates, meaning that a $50 advance would require $100 to be deducted from the worker's next paycheck. For individuals already struggling to break even, these advances created mathematical impossibilities that ensured permanent indebtedness. The financial system that Evans had constructed was a masterpiece of exploitation, designed to ensure that workers could never accumulate enough money to leave his operations while simultaneously maximizing the profit he could extract from their labor. Understanding this system requires examining each component of how workers were charged, paid, and ultimately trapped in cycles of perpetual debt. Workers typically earned minimum wage for their field labor, though even this basic standard was often violated through various manipulations of hours worked and productivity requirements. A full-time worker might theoretically earn around $200 per week before deductions. However, the deduction system that Evans had implemented ensured that workers never saw anything approaching this amount in actual take-home pay. The $50 weekly housing charge was presented as reasonable, but it represented just the beginning of the financial obligations that workers would face. Meals were charged separately, and workers were required to purchase food through Evans's system rather than being allowed to shop independently. The cost of these meals was inflated significantly beyond their actual value, often consuming another $60 to $80 per week from workers' paychecks. Transportation to and from work sites was treated as a service provided by Evans, for which workers were charged additional fees. These transportation charges could easily consume another $30 to $40 per week, despite the fact that workers had no choice in the matter and were not permitted to arrange their own transportation to work sites. The company store system was perhaps the most insidious component of Evans's financial trap. Workers needed basic necessities like soap, shampoo, work clothes, and personal items, but they had no access to regular retail establishments where these items could be purchased at normal prices. Evans's stores charged prices that were often 3 to 5 times higher than typical retail costs. A bar of soap that might cost $1 in a regular store would be priced at $4. Work boots that might retail for $30 would cost $120. More problematic still was the availability of addictive substances through the company stores. Beer, cigarettes, and crack cocaine were readily available, and workers struggling with addiction found themselves spending significant portions of their earnings on these substances. The crack cocaine was often included directly in pay envelopes as advances against future wages, creating immediate debt obligations for workers who accepted these substances. The advance system that Evans employed was particularly cruel in its mathematical impossibility. Workers who found themselves short of money during the week could request advances on their upcoming paychecks. These advances were readily granted, but they came with 100% interest rates. A worker who borrowed $20 would owe $40 to be deducted from their next paycheck. For workers already struggling to break even, these advances created spiraling debt cycles that became mathematically impossible to escape. Evans and his associates actively encouraged workers to take these advances, particularly in the form of crack cocaine. On payday, workers would often find small amounts of the drug included in their pay envelopes, with notes indicating that they now owed double the street value of the substance to be deducted from their following paycheck. This practice created immediate addiction-driven debt cycles that trapped workers more effectively than any physical restraints could have accomplished. The cumulative effect of all these charges and fees meant that workers often found themselves owing money to Evans at the end of each week, despite having worked full-time under difficult conditions. A worker might theoretically earn $200, but after housing, meals, transportation, company store purchases, and advance repayments, they could easily owe Evans $50 or $100. This debt would then be carried forward to the following week, where it would accumulate interest and additional charges, making it even more impossible to achieve financial independence. The financial entrapment that Evans had constructed was reinforced by a comprehensive system of psychological and physical control that made escape nearly impossible for workers trapped in his operations. This control system operated on multiple levels, from the isolation of the camps themselves to the careful manipulation of workers' basic human needs and vulnerabilities. Physical isolation was the foundation of Evans's control system. The camps in Palatka, Florida, and Newton Grove, North Carolina, were deliberately located in remote rural areas, far from public transportation, law enforcement agencies, or social services that might provide assistance to workers seeking to leave. Workers often didn't know their exact geographic location, having been transported to the camps in vehicles with tinted windows along routes they couldn't remember or retrace. The absence of personal transportation was crucial to maintaining this isolation. Workers were not permitted to own vehicles, and even if they had somehow acquired the money to purchase transportation, they had no secure place to park or maintain it within the camps. All movement to and from work sites was controlled entirely by Evans and his associates. Workers who needed to leave the property for any reason had to request permission and transportation, which could be granted or denied at the discretion of camp management. Communication with the outside world was severely restricted. Workers were not provided with telephones, and the remote locations of the camps meant that cellular service was often unavailable or unreliable. Even when workers could establish contact with family members or social service agencies, they often didn't know their location well enough to provide useful information about where they were being held. Evans and his associates maintained discipline through a combination of psychological manipulation and the ever-present threat of abandonment. Workers who complained about conditions or challenged the camp's rules were threatened with immediate expulsion from the operation. Given that most workers had no money, no transportation, and often didn't know where they were located, the threat of being abandoned in rural North Carolina or Florida was genuinely terrifying. The drug distribution system served multiple purposes within Evans's control structure. Beyond generating additional revenue and creating debt obligations, the availability of crack cocaine helped maintain a compliant workforce. Workers struggling with addiction were easier to control and less likely to organize resistance to the camp's conditions. The drugs also served as a form of payment that reduced Evans's cash obligations while increasing workers' dependency on his system. Medical care was essentially non-existent within the camps, despite the dangerous nature of the work and the poor living conditions. Workers who became injured or ill were expected to continue working or risk losing their positions. Access to outside medical care was restricted, both by the isolation of the camps and by workers' lack of financial resources. This meant that treatable conditions often became serious health problems, further reducing workers' ability to seek alternative employment or leave the operations. Evans had also constructed a hierarchy within the camps that helped maintain order and discouraged collective resistance. Certain long-term workers were given supervisory roles and small privileges in exchange for helping to manage newer arrivals and report potential troublemakers. This system created divisions within the worker population and made it more difficult for individuals to organize collective action against the conditions they faced. Perhaps most insidiously, Evans actively worked to destroy workers' self-esteem and sense of personal worth. He would regularly remind workers that they were homeless individuals with addiction problems whom no one else would employ. He portrayed his operations as charitable endeavors that provided opportunities for people that society had otherwise abandoned. This psychological manipulation made it more difficult for workers to recognize that they were being exploited and gave them reasons to feel grateful for conditions that were actually abusive. The combination of financial entrapment, physical isolation, controlled communication, limited medical care, internal hierarchy systems, and psychological manipulation created a comprehensive control structure that was remarkably effective at preventing workers from escaping Evans's operations. Workers found themselves trapped not just by debt and geographic isolation, but by a carefully constructed system that attacked their sense of personal agency and self-worth. While the human exploitation occurring at Evans's labor camps represented the most serious crimes being committed, the operations also included significant environmental violations that demonstrated a complete disregard for public health and safety regulations. These environmental crimes, particularly the contamination of local water supplies, revealed the broader impact of Evans's operations on the communities surrounding his camps. The most serious environmental violation involved the disposal of sewage from the labor camp's septic systems. Rather than properly maintaining these systems or arranging for legitimate waste disposal services, Evans chose to dump the contents of heavily used septic tanks directly into local waterways. At the Palatka facility, this sewage was discharged into Cow Creek, a tributary of the St. Johns River. The environmental impact of this sewage dumping was severe and long-lasting. Cow Creek serves as habitat for local wildlife and eventually feeds into larger water systems that affect much broader geographic areas. The discharge of untreated human waste introduced dangerous bacteria, viruses, and other pathogens into these waterways, creating public health hazards that extended far beyond Evans's immediate operations. The decision to dump sewage directly into waterways was not made out of ignorance or accident. Evans was aware of proper waste disposal requirements and had been operating these facilities for many years. The dumping represented a calculated decision to save money on legitimate waste management services, regardless of the environmental and public health consequences. The environmental violations were symptomatic of broader regulatory failures that had allowed Evans's operations to continue for nearly 2 decades. Despite multiple investigations and citations dating back to 1988, regulatory agencies had failed to take decisive action to shut down operations that were clearly violating numerous laws and regulations. The Department of Labor had investigated Evans's operations multiple times, beginning in 1988 when he was fined $1,350 for failing to register an employee as a farm labor contractor and transporting workers without proper vehicle insurance. These early violations should have triggered more intensive oversight, but the regulatory response was minimal and ineffective. In 1992, the Department of Labor again cited Evans's operations, this time ordering him to pay $4,060 for providing unsafe housing, not paying wages on time, and not keeping proper employer records at the Newton Grove facility. Once again, despite clear evidence of systematic violations, the regulatory response consisted only of financial penalties that represented a small fraction of the profits Evans was extracting from his operations. Florida's Department of Business and Professional Regulation had also conducted investigations of Evans's operations over the years, but these investigations failed to uncover the full scope of the human trafficking and debt bondage that was occurring at the facilities. The regulatory agencies seemed to treat Evans's operations as typical labor violations rather than recognizing them as systematic human trafficking operations. The failure of regulatory oversight was compounded by the isolation of Evans's operations and the vulnerability of his workforce. Traditional labor inspections rely partly on worker complaints and testimonies, but Evans's workers were effectively prevented from communicating with regulatory agencies. They didn't know how to contact appropriate authorities, they were afraid of retaliation, and they often didn't understand their legal rights as workers. The environmental crimes and regulatory failures surrounding Evans's operations illustrate how predators can exploit gaps in oversight systems to continue harmful activities for extended periods. The agencies responsible for protecting both workers and environmental resources had multiple opportunities to discover and shut down these operations, but bureaucratic limitations and inadequate enforcement mechanisms allowed the crimes to continue for years. The investigation that would eventually bring down Ronald Evans's labor camp operations began not through regulatory oversight or law enforcement initiative, but through the gradual recognition by federal prosecutors that they were dealing with something far more serious than typical labor violations. The path to discovery was long and complex, involving multiple agencies and requiring investigators to understand the sophisticated nature of modern human trafficking operations. The first significant break in the case came through the testimony of workers who had managed to escape from Evans's operations. These individuals, many of whom struggled with credibility issues due to their histories of homelessness and addiction, began appearing at social service agencies and legal aid organizations with stories that seemed almost impossible to believe. They described systematic debt bondage, the distribution of illegal drugs as payment, and conditions that resembled something from America's historical plantation system. Initially, these testimonies were met with skepticism by authorities who had difficulty believing that such operations could exist in modern America, particularly under the oversight of established regulatory agencies. The workers' backgrounds made them challenging witnesses, and their accounts of being paid with crack cocaine seemed too extreme to be credible. However, as more escaped workers came forward with consistent accounts of their experiences, federal investigators began to take these claims more seriously. The stories shared common elements that suggested a systematic operation rather than isolated incidents. Multiple witnesses described the same debt structure, the same company store pricing, and the same methods of control and intimidation. The investigation gained momentum when federal prosecutors realized that Evans's operations potentially violated federal human trafficking statutes. Unlike traditional labor violations, which are typically handled through administrative processes and civil penalties, human trafficking is a federal crime carrying serious criminal penalties. This shift in legal framework brought resources and investigative capabilities that had not previously been applied to Evans's operations. Federal investigators began conducting surveillance of Evans's facilities, documenting the isolation of the camps and the restricted movement of workers. They observed the transportation of workers to and from agricultural sites, noting the security measures that prevented workers from leaving independently. They also began investigating Evans's financial records, looking for evidence of the debt bondage system that witnesses had described. The financial investigation proved particularly revealing. Bank records showed that Evans was generating substantial revenues from his operations while paying minimal wages to workers. The investigators found evidence of the company's store markups, the advance system, and the systematic extraction of money from workers through various fees and charges. Investigators also discovered evidence of the environmental crimes that Evans was committing. The illegal discharge of sewage into local waterways was documented through environmental sampling and photographic evidence. This environmental component added additional federal charges and helped establish a pattern of systematic legal violations. Perhaps most importantly, the investigation revealed the sophisticated nature of Evans's recruitment and control systems. Investigators documented how Evans and his associates targeted vulnerable populations in urban areas, the promises made during recruitment, and the methods used to transport workers to the remote camp locations. The investigation also uncovered the role of crack cocaine in Evans's operations. Federal agents found evidence of drug distribution within the camps, including records of how drugs were included in pay envelopes and how drug debts were calculated and collected. This evidence helped prosecutors understand how Evans was using addiction as a tool of control and financial exploitation. As the investigation progressed, federal agents were able to build cases not just against Evans himself, but against 3 associates who helped operate the camps and maintain the system of control over workers. This broader scope helped prosecutors understand the organizational structure of the operation and the roles that different individuals played in maintaining the systematic exploitation. The investigation culminated in federal indictments against Evans and his associates on charges including human trafficking, debt bondage, drug distribution, and environmental crimes. The complexity of the case required prosecutors to educate judges and juries about modern forms of slavery and how they operate within seemingly legitimate industries. The federal prosecution of Ronald Evans and his associates represented one of the most significant modern slavery cases to be tried in the United States, establishing legal precedents for how human trafficking operations could be prosecuted under existing federal statutes. The case, formerly known as United States v. Evans, required prosecutors to demonstrate how debt bondage and systematic exploitation could occur within the framework of legitimate agricultural operations. The trial began in federal court in 2005, with prosecutors facing the challenging task of proving that Evans's operations constituted human trafficking rather than simply labor violations. The distinction was crucial, as human trafficking carries much more serious penalties and federal jurisdiction, while labor violations are typically handled through administrative processes with limited criminal consequences. Prosecutors built their case around the testimony of workers who had escaped from Evans's camps, supplemented by financial records, surveillance evidence, and documentation of the environmental crimes. The worker testimonies were particularly powerful, as they provided first-hand accounts of the systematic exploitation and control that characterized Evans's operations. One worker who testified for NPR and later in the trial described how any pay advances he received had to be repaid at 100% interest, making it mathematically impossible to ever accumulate enough money to leave the operation. This testimony helped establish the debt bondage component of the charges, demonstrating how Evans had created financial obligations that could never realistically be satisfied. The prosecution also presented evidence of the crack cocaine distribution system that Evans had established within his camps. Federal agents testified about finding drugs in pay envelopes and about the systematic way that drug debts were calculated and collected. This evidence was crucial in establishing both the drug distribution charges and the methods of control that Evans used to maintain his workforce. Perhaps most damaging to Evans's defense was the financial evidence that prosecutors presented. Bank records and business documents showed the enormous profits that Evans was generating from his operations while paying minimal wages to workers. The evidence demonstrated that Evans was systematically extracting maximum value from vulnerable workers while providing substandard housing, food, and working conditions. The environmental crimes provided additional evidence of Evans's disregard for legal requirements and public safety. Prosecutors presented photographs and environmental testing results showing the contamination of local waterways with untreated sewage from the labor camps. This evidence helped establish a pattern of systematic legal violations that supported the broader human trafficking charges. Evans's defense attorneys argued that their client was operating legitimate agricultural labor operations and that any problems were the result of the workers' own issues with addiction and irresponsibility. They portrayed Evans as someone who was providing opportunities for homeless individuals whom other employers wouldn't hire. However, the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. The systematic nature of the exploitation, the sophisticated control mechanisms, and the clear evidence of financial manipulation made it impossible to characterize Evans's operations as legitimate employment opportunities. The jury was able to see that Evans had created a comprehensive system designed to trap workers in perpetual debt while extracting maximum profit from their labor. The trial also revealed the regulatory failures that had allowed Evans's operations to continue for nearly 2 decades. Testimony showed that multiple government agencies had investigated Evans's facilities over the years but had failed to recognize or effectively address the human trafficking that was occurring. On January 26, 2007, Ronald Robert Evans Sr. was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison followed by 3 years of supervised release. This sentence reflected the serious nature of the crimes and sent a message that human trafficking operations would face severe consequences under federal law. The sentences for Evans's associates were also significant, though somewhat less than the punishment imposed on the primary defendant. The court recognized that Evans had been the architect and primary beneficiary of the trafficking operation while his associates had played supporting roles in its implementation. The Evans case established important legal precedents for prosecuting modern slavery operations. It demonstrated how debt bondage could be proven in federal court and how systematic financial exploitation could constitute human trafficking under federal statutes. The case also highlighted the importance of recognizing human trafficking in agricultural operations, where isolation and vulnerable populations can create conditions conducive to exploitation. The conviction and sentencing of Ronald Evans marked not just the end of his particular trafficking operation, but the beginning of a broader national conversation about modern slavery in American agriculture and the systematic failures that allow such exploitation to persist. The case became a catalyst for legislative hearings, policy reforms, and increased awareness of human trafficking in industries that many Americans assumed were adequately regulated. On April 15, 2008, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont chaired a Senate hearing titled "Ending Abuses and Improving Working Conditions for Tomato Workers." This hearing, which took place just over a year after Evans's sentencing, brought together lawmakers, advocates, law enforcement officials, and industry representatives to examine the broader patterns of exploitation that the Evans case had revealed. Lucas Benitez, co-founder of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, provided testimony that placed the Evans case within the broader context of agricultural labor exploitation. His organization had been documenting similar abuses throughout Florida's agricultural regions, and his testimony helped senators understand that trafficking operations like Evans's were more common than most people realized. Detective Charlie Frost of Collier County, Florida, who had specialized in anti-trafficking investigations, testified about the law enforcement challenges in identifying and prosecuting these cases. His testimony revealed how trafficking operations often hide within legitimate industries and how the vulnerability of victims makes investigation and prosecution particularly difficult. Investigative reporter Eric Schlosser, whose work had helped expose labor abuses in various industries, provided context about the economic pressures that create conditions conducive to trafficking. His testimony helped senators understand how consumer demands for cheap food products create incentives for employers to minimize labor costs through exploitation. Mary Bauer, director of the Immigrant Justice Project, testified about the legal and social vulnerabilities that make certain populations particularly susceptible to trafficking. Her testimony highlighted how homelessness, addiction, immigration status, and limited English proficiency can make individuals easy targets for traffickers like Evans. Industry representatives, including Reggie Brown, executive vice president of the Florida Tomato Growers Exchange, and Roy Reyna, a farm manager from Immokalee, Florida, provided perspectives from legitimate agricultural operations. Their testimony helped senators understand the differences between legitimate labor contracting and the trafficking operations that the Evans case had revealed. The hearing addressed several key policy areas that the Evans case had highlighted as problematic. These included the need for better oversight of labor contractors, improved protection for vulnerable workers, stronger enforcement of existing labor laws, and better coordination between different regulatory agencies. However, the story of Ronald Evans took an unexpected turn during the COVID-19 pandemic. As federal prisons struggled with disease outbreaks, Evans was transferred to home confinement as part of broader efforts to reduce prison populations and limit virus transmission. This home confinement, initially intended as a temporary health measure, became a pathway to an early release that many of his victims and advocates found deeply troubling. On December 12, 2024, Evans was granted executive clemency as part of a group of pardons for COVID home confinement inmates. This clemency effectively ended his federal supervision and restored many of his civil rights, despite having served only a portion of his original 30-year sentence. The clemency decision sparked controversy among anti-trafficking advocates who argued that such serious crimes warranted full punishment. The Evans case continues to influence discussions about agricultural labor practices and human trafficking prosecution. It demonstrated how modern slavery can operate within seemingly legitimate industries and how systematic exploitation can persist for years without detection. The case also revealed the importance of recognizing that human trafficking victims don't always fit popular stereotypes and that some of the most vulnerable individuals in American society can become trapped in modern slavery operations. The regulatory reforms that followed the Evans case have improved oversight of agricultural labor operations, but advocates continue to argue that more comprehensive changes are needed. The isolation of agricultural work sites, the vulnerability of many agricultural workers, and the economic pressures facing agricultural operations continue to create conditions that can facilitate exploitation. Perhaps most importantly, the Evans case demonstrated the importance of listening to and believing victims of trafficking, even when their backgrounds or circumstances make them seem like unreliable witnesses. The workers who escaped from Evans's camps and testified about their experiences were initially met with skepticism, but their courage in coming forward ultimately led to justice and systemic reforms that have protected other vulnerable workers. As we reach the end of this investigation into the labor camps operated by Ronald Evans, we're left with uncomfortable questions about the systems that failed to protect some of our society's most vulnerable members. The case reveals how easily exploitation can hide within legitimate industries, protected by isolation, bureaucratic gaps, and the very vulnerabilities that make certain populations targets for traffickers. The workers who found themselves trapped in Evans's operations had sought nothing more than honest work and basic dignity. Instead, they discovered that their desperation had made them prey for a predator who viewed their humanity as nothing more than a resource to be exploited for profit. Their stories remind us that the promise of the American dream can become a nightmare when those promises are made by those who profit from human suffering. Tonight's case also demonstrates the importance of persistence in seeking justice. The workers who escaped Evans's camps and found the courage to tell their stories faced skepticism and disbelief, but their testimonies ultimately led to convictions and systemic reforms. Their courage serves as a reminder that justice often depends on the willingness of survivors to speak truth to power, even when that truth seems too disturbing to believe. As you rest tonight, remember that the fight against modern slavery continues in communities across our nation. The Evans case was resolved through prosecution and punishment, but the conditions that allowed it to exist for nearly 2 decades persist in other forms and other places. Vigilance, compassion, and commitment to human dignity remain our best defenses against those who would exploit the vulnerable for profit. If you're still awake after that, subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment. Which case should we cover next?